Right, whenever y'all are ready. Good morning, evening, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We will be discussing the theme of the causes of war and what our responsibilities are to the communities that we leave. Basically, we'll be looking at the consequences of war through the framework of the humanitarian development and peacekeeping nexus. For this webinar today, we are joined by three wonderful professionals. I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves one by one, starting with Sarah Yim. You have the floor.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Yim. Currently, I'm a co-founder of an NGO called Transit Initiatives. We started because we wanted to help Afghans evacuate and resettle in August of last year. So it is I'll be honest, it's a temporary NGO that we've started for a very temporary purpose because we hope that the evacuation issue will subside soon. But previously, my prior life was that I was a USAID government official for more than 10 years in the space of conflict and humanitarian aid. And I worked in Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, and ended really my career focusing on Somalia and the conflict around Somalia for the last 4 years.
Thank you. Now I would direct the virtual mic to Adrian Bravo. You may have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Adrian Bravo. I'm an assistant professor at the College of William & Mary in Virginia in the United States. My areas of research predominantly focus on substance use and mental health across young adults in various countries. However, more recently, I've done a lot of research on a term called moral injury and looking at that form of trauma, not among military members, and more recently with insight, looking at it among individuals in the humanitarian sector.
Thank you. And lastly, but not least, we have Alex Tarzakan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Tarzakan. I'm currently a clinical legal fellow at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law in Chicago. I have a law degree and a master's in public health. I'm originally Syrian, and my research interests lie in the fields of human rights, global health, and migration. But I also look at humanitarian principles and how they're applied in conflict zones. Also had a project in Somalia looking at the intersection of climate change, peace, and security there. And also worked in various refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Greece. And I'm the founder of the Meet a Refugee Instagram page, which is a platform to share refugee stories to kind of change the narrative and humanize the refugee crisis. Happy to be here.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. As you can tell, our panelists are full with a wealth of experience and knowledge from various different fields. So hopefully the conversation that you will be hearing here today will be insightful. Pun intended. Before we start with the discussion, I'd just like to welcome all of the attendees to use the chat feature and the Q&A function as well to write in any comments or questions that you may have for the panel, and I'll be sure to read it out at the appropriate time. So let's all start with the first question. Anyone can feel free to raise their hands or unmute themselves to get started. So the first question is, what do you consider to be the causes of conflict?
I'm happy to go first. I think there are obviously multiple tolls that are involved here. The biggest one I think that comes to mind is namely the death toll, the number of civilians that are ultimately end up being caught in this conflict. And then also you have the instability that is created just because there's no really rule of law. There's a breakdown in the legal systems. You have the mental health impacts that develop as a result. of the conflicts, the social and economic impact of the war. Just by example, in Syria, there's now a lack of access to healthcare, education, housing. So both on the economic and social rights components, but then also on the political and civil rights, because there's a lack of accountability, there's no redress mechanisms, and you also have an inability of the civilians who currently live there to be able to survive, just because there's this breakdown in the healthcare system, there's inflation, deepening and economic and political crises, and then namely also a wave of displacement that is caused as well.
It's interesting that you brought up, the many dimensions of society that are affected by war, starting with the death toll to economic with inflation and mass displacement. What do you think is the common thread in all of this for the causes of conflict? What is something that you always see in different countries around the world, no matter what the context is? Do you think that the causes are the same everywhere, or how would you view it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to generalize because I think it's very context specific, but I do think you do overall see this common thread of human rights violations that occur as a result of the conflict. You also want to think about, why the conflict started. It could be because there were human rights violations that were occurring in the first place, but it all, at the end of the day, there's this common theme of a breakdown of law and order in society that, impacts different human rights violations that are occurring, whether that's, again, someone trying to promote their own political or ideological agendas, or trying to promote the welfare of one group versus another. And also, there could also be a conflict over access to resources. You see that, in Somalia, the other example I had, referenced in my introduction. What we're seeing now, there are a lot of herder conflicts that are happening because there's a lack of resources. Many droughts are occurring, so farmers don't have access to water. And so herder conflicts are occurring there. So I think the common theme, without having to generalize, is just there's human rights violations are bound to occur because there's lack of societal order.
Anyone else would like to add? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, kind of jumping off where Alex left off about this common thread and focusing particularly among the individuals affected. I think one of the biggest things, along with health, in my training, and particularly in psychology and looking at their mental health, I think a common thing, particularly, is their understanding of where they are in the world and what the world looks like drastically changes while these conflicts occur, and particularly how ambiguous the world becomes, and where has their teachings and their understandings about what is right and wrong gets affected within these conflicts, and things become much, much more grayer. And in the research we do with regards to like moral injury, which really you can conceptualize as really this kind of cognitive dissonance of how do you approach things that are morally ambiguous and go counter to what your upbringing or teachings are, and how do you deal with that? And for some people, they can kind of just, it is what it is, it's part of the situation, I can get over it. But for a lot of people, they do feel betrayal, guilt, shame, all these things that really affect how they move forward and trying to resolve what's going on within their lives, and how this conflict is affecting every aspect of their well-being.
And first of all, I think Alex and Adrian really captured, I think, the whole sort of context of sort of the conflicts around the world. But I will add that I think that the common theme that I think I do see is that overall, you do start seeing that there's a lack of trust with yourself, first of all, right? Kind of that moral injury point. You see a lack of trust with your community, and who can you trust? Who is your ally? And you see a lack of trust with the institutions that are set up because they're not delivering. And that to me is a foundational breakdown of a society not working. And I think that that is the common sort of picture that I see in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Syria, is that people think that they're alone because they don't have anyone really that they can trust. And they've sort of lacked the faith that either the government can deliver for them or their community can deliver for them. Or they can deliver for their own families, because that sort of environment has disappeared from them, because those resources aren't there, or the market is, not functioning anymore. The economy isn't working, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that how do we build trust is a question that I often think about when I'm trying to program in these places. How do we build that sort of connectivity and that tissue so that people can start connecting emotionally even? And how do we do that so that we can start building that sort of bedrock of trust and society and faith again?
I really like that point that both of you brought up about, trust and this sort of discrepancy between perceived versus real, I guess, needs. And it really speaks to the larger dialogue of how conflict actually ascends to war. Because there's, discussion between what's the difference between destructive conflict and constructive conflict. Just because a conflict is occurring doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. Especially in the peace studies field, there's been, a lot of talk about how conflict is actually a necessary and very natural part of living in society, because that's what starts dialogue and that's what creates systemic changes where it's needed. So how do you all view, the causes of conflict in this context? Does it necessarily, how do you prevent conflict from becoming war, basically?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I would think a lot of leaders would like to know the answer for that as well. And I think this is where diplomacy and kind of really is valuable in that sense. But I think a big mistake is that when doing those things, there's always a side, and one side always believes they're right and the others don't. And the problem is we don't ever look at the people who are most affected and getting their input and their experiences. And the stakeholders are usually people thinking really up level high of how this affects us. But the individuals who suffer most are at the bottom level, but we never ask about them, ask what their opinions are and things like that. And it's due to power imbalances and things like that. But without getting information from all those individuals, the way to avoid those severe things, it won't be accomplished in a very peaceful way. And so better diplomacy and better educating ourselves about the other side's point of view and where those conflict is coming from. What is the central issue? Well, how are perspectives being looked at around this central issue? We'll never agree on everything, but can we do it in a more respectful and diplomatic way where it avoids the idea that we have to lead to combat? And in my research a lot with military individuals, particularly the soldiers themselves, that's one of the biggest issues that they have, particularly those soldiers who were part of OEF and OIF from the US when they were in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. And now that it's ended, a lot of them like, why were we there? Like, what is going on? And there's so many ambiguity kind of things, and there's laws and rules of engagement and all those kind of things. And in reading and working with military veterans who dealt with it, it was really hard for them. They're like, I want to help these people. By law, I'm not supposed to. Where does that draw the line? And I think overall, getting better at diplomacy, but really understanding the core issues and under people's perspectives to get a more peaceful resolution might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add that I think that we have to really get around and really understand terms, I think that when we talk about conflict and war, it sounds like the same thing, and because it is, but as experts in a field, we need to relay to people, well, actually, there are local conflicts, there are big conflicts that look like war, there are communal conflicts, there are tribal conflicts, and a lot of these things can be mitigated at a local level. I think that once it becomes a national level conflict is when things are a little bit hairy, right? When you have maybe military interventions, foreign interventions, you have the UN. I mean, that's a large scale conflict, and I do think there are steps that we can take to get there. There are peacekeeping measures, or conflict mitigation programs. There's a lot of intercommunal dialogues that exist to try to avoid getting to a place where that big conflict could arise. But I also think there's a lot of time in between all of that as well. And that I think that first, maybe because of sort of all the movies we've watched in the world, we think that that little conflict could actually lead to that big scale war and Iraq, Afghanistan sort of situation in a month. And that's not necessarily the case. It's a lot of issues that continue to come up that either destabilize the regions or ruin sort of the institutional trust between government and people in certain locations, where you start seeing people either advocating or lobbying for change, or it's where you see sort of a tangible way that people are acting out is that sort of local level conflict. And so I do think that it is possible to avoid a national large scale war. And I do think that there are mechanisms in place. I do think that, it doesn't always look like success for a lot of people. So for instance, in South Sudan, there are a lot of conflict mitigation programs and peace building organizations that exist. And South Sudan is, it's still, I wouldn't say it's like peaceful, but it's not at a large scale war that it once was, like in the case of Sudan and South Sudan. And so I think that, it's, again, going back to what do we mean when we say some of these things? And how do we clarify and clearly to the public what the situation actually looks like on the ground? And so that, because we have to educate the public so that they actually understand what is it that we're trying to talk about when we actually say conflict, and as we sort of dive into like these articles, you read up and you understand some of the context more, you recognize how much is actually missing around context, around the situation. So I just wanted to add that I think that really understanding what we're trying to say and educating people around us is also very key to that process.
Yeah, and I agree with both of those points. I think just to add to what Sarah said, I think the tendency is to use the term war just because it might seem like an easy alternative. But legally, there's an array of different concepts and laws that need to be considered, and it is very nuanced and it is very context specific. And if you look at, for example, the what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, do we consider that a war, or what is it that we consider it? Sometimes, if we do call it a war, this might lead to volatile political and emotive consequences. And so, oftentimes there's a diplomatic reason as to why it's not being labeled a war. So just sticking to that terminology and being aware of what it means in current international law, I think is important as well, just in order to avoid carelessly escalating the rhetoric and the risk of unintended consequences.
There were actually a couple of points that pivot to the second question that we were going to discuss, which is, what are the traditional mechanisms by which people can be supported post-conflict? I know that Sarah referenced the South Sudan example. So if anyone would like to jump in about the kinds of traditional mechanisms they've come across in their work or study by which people are supported post-conflict, or even pre-conflict, if you've had experience with that, please feel free to share.
Yeah, I guess I can start, and I'm gonna start with a different approach of thinking of the people who have been displaced and have been to move into these other areas or new countries based on that displacement. I myself was born in Cuba, and me and my family immigrated as political refugees to the United States. And early on, my dad ended up working at it was funded by the state, and what was a refugee office that would take in new political, whatever type of refugees they were, and try to get them to assimilate to the location that we were living in. And through that, you opened your eyes and realized that there is no one answer for everyone. Everyone's dealing with unique kind of aspects. For us, it was political reasons. For others, it's war. For others, it's economics. But the organization, the way they did it was providing resources for those individuals once they were displaced, and an ability for them to be connected, not only to what the culture is and the United States, and particularly in Virginia, in the area we grew up in, but how can we also keep who they are and where they come from as a core aspect of who they are, and not having them to be forced into something unknown, something that's so foreign to them that it's not going to be easy for them to do. And through that organization that my dad worked for a little bit, it really was illuminating, kind of getting this idea of we can do all of these things, but there has to be better connection across all of those things. And I think that's where my dad got most frustrated with, was this lack of cohesive kind of moving forward, both from a national to state to local. And it really, and particularly for Alex and Sarah, who has way more experience than I do with working in these sectors, is that a lot of people feel isolated and that they're trying to solve something on their own. And without the support of bigger kind of policies and things like that, it does make it hard. And I think even for the individuals who are suffering from this, they feel so alone, like what was mentioned earlier. They don't know what's the right answer, what's the right approach, what are they supposed to do? And importantly, they are making sacrifices. Whether it's when we immigrated, we left a lot of family back in Cuba. That is, I mean, eventually we brought them over, but all those things draw conflict within themselves of how to deal with those things. And I think overall better communication across and driven goals across many layers will be the only way to really help individuals.
You mentioned something that was really interesting, which is sort of the issue of, this pressure of having your identity erased as you're being displaced to new locations. Could you talk to us a little bit more about your experience with how you personally dealt with, or other resettled refugees have been dealing with this pressure of trying to find ways to heal at their own pace, in a way that makes sense to them, either culturally or communally and all that? Could you speak on that?
Yeah, so I can speak of it from two different ways. So a group that I work with here locally, working with lawyers actually and clinical psychologists, really helping out, particularly those from Latin America who are coming over, asylum seekers or other individuals who may be undocumented. We assist them with not only getting them the legal services that they need to help them, but more importantly, what is the mental health things that they've gone through. A lot of these individuals have gone through very traumatic kind of experiences, and dealing with that, you can't just ignore and like, well, you're here now, everything should be better. That's not exactly the way that it actually works in dealing with those things. And then with the identity stuff, I mean, particularly within, if they're immigrating to the US, research is really convoluted because there is this thing that occurs that's called the immigration paradox. And that at least among US Latinos, the primary immigrants, the people who are here for the first time, they actually are doing pretty good mental health and things like that. It's actually the next generation after that that really struggles because they're caught in two worlds. They're caught in their parents' world of their culture, their beliefs, and the conflicts that they've had to deal with. But yet they're being pulled by, at least in this in the United States, this American culture. And in the research that we've seen, that's the group that really suffers a lot of it because they just don't know how to manage both sides of those things. And at the same time, they understand that why their parents may have come here, there's so many underlying layers that even their parents don't even tell them of all the conflicts, all the things they have to deal with because they're trying to protect them themselves. And I think making sure that when they come, it's not, well, everything's going to be okay now, that all your conflicts are over. that is not far from the truth. And particularly for those individuals who still have family members back home and are still struggling through these conflicts, they just can't ignore them either. So how can we help them still help the individuals and family members that they care about back home is important as well.
It's definitely a intergenerational effort. Sarah and Alex, if you'd like to add anything.
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank Adrian for helping clarify why I suffer with the immigrant paradox. But yeah, going back to your question on traditional mechanisms, and I think that in terms of post-conflict scenarios, going back to like, and I hate to break it down into like terms again, but it's really, there's ongoing mechanisms within a conflict, and then there are mechanisms that probably exist when post-kinetic operations cease. And I think that they do differ. And really, when it comes down to post-kinetic operations, it's really about stabilization of that society and that community and sort of the individuals. And I know that in my past experience, we've, for instance, at the sort of individual community level, we've tried to work on trauma healing, for instance. But at a communal level, it's really looking at, well, what does this community actually need to actually recover from conflict in these locations? And a lot of that first starts with dialogue. It's really trying to get an understanding of what are those needs? How do you feel? Or how can the government actually respond to these locations and provide the institutions so that people can go on and move on with their lives? Like, for instance, getting your kids educated is very important for most of the world. It is number one, always, it seems to be on the list. Every time I talk to so many communities, and you think, really, even in the midst of all of this chaos, you're thinking about education for your kids. And if my kids can get an education, at least I can feel like there's hope for them for the future, right? And in some ways that fulfills not just a communal need for stability, but it fulfills the individual need as a parent, and it fulfills the emotional need that there is hope for the future. And so I do think that those mechanisms, in my opinion, do exist. I have experience actually implementing some of these. And then, of course, within a conflict, and that kind of going to my earlier point, is that there are conflict mitigation mechanisms as well. And a lot of people call that traditionally peace building programs, right? And so I do think that those mechanisms do exist. They may not always reach everyone, and unfortunately, and that's the issue. And hopefully the goal is always for all these donors and organizations is that you do try to reach sort of the majority of the population, so that there is an inclusive approach to how you're designing these programs, so that everyone feels, for the most part, their community members for the most part feel seen, feel heard, and there's buy-in. And with that sort of buy-in, hopefully there's an inclusive approach to ensuring that these mechanisms are successful. So I believe that I believe that they exist. It's never going to be perfect, because you are in conflict, post-conflict, pre-conflict, every conflict. It's never going to be perfect, but there are mechanisms that do exist.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, it's having different UN peacekeeping mechanisms is important. And the one that comes to mind is the UN peacekeeping missions. But obviously they are not perfect because oftentimes they're not necessarily tailored and do not take in everyone's point of view and everyone's different interests into account. But I think they are strong in terms of providing, legitimacy, because it is coming from the UN Security Council. It provides burden sharing responsibilities and an ability to deploy both troops and police from around the globe and integrate them with the civilian peacekeepers. And it's mostly guided by three basic principles, which are the consent of parties, so that you need, consent of everyone involved. impartiality, and also non-use of force. And I think where I've seen it be most successful is in terms of their DDR initiative. So that's disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, where you remove arms from former combatants and you help them reintegrate into their society by rebuilding trust, finding other ways of livelihoods, and also providing them with, legitimacy and accountability. But I think it has to be, more integrated in terms of everyone's needs. And there has to be more of an accountability mechanism when things don't go as planned.
Something that just came to me after listening to everyone's reflections is, what is the role of the diaspora, especially the people who are displaced from the conflict who left the country? What is their role or responsibility to the people that are still left behind in the post-conflict setting? How do you think they can support these traditional mechanisms that are already being implemented in the country of conflict?
Yeah, I mean, for me, as someone who's Syrian, and I was fortunate to have a U.S. passport, I was able to leave Syria right at the start of the war. But because of that privilege, I felt like I had a responsibility to give back. And so for me, I did that by educating people who weren't necessarily aware of what was going on, of the different tensions involved, the different conflicts that were erupting. Because again, one just thinks of Syria, they just think it's one war, but there are many things that are happening. There's a sectarian war. There's obviously the political war between the government and civilians, and then there's also ISIS involved as well. And so for me, I found the responsibility to give back by educating people around me, and also sharing refugee stories, because I had gone to Greece and I volunteered. The first time I went, I didn't really know what to expect. And then it was a really rewarding experience to me. So I wanted to keep going back anytime I had free time. And I came back, and it was around the time of the Trump administration. There was all this negative rhetoric around refugees and, different narratives around what a refugee means. And so I decided to try and change that by sharing refugee stories and just connecting people on a more personal level by showing them, similarities that people had with each other versus, I'm a refugee, this is like the legal term. So that's kind of how I saw it. And I think, as being someone part of the diaspora, you can give back in the same way, by staying connected to the issue, being aware of what's happening on the ground, even if the media has stopped covering it. And also, being fully aware that there are refugees who are resettling in your community. Even if you're not able to go and volunteer in Greece, you can help people who are here in your own community who have just recently resettled, who need someone to help them navigate the healthcare system, who need someone to help them read their mail. Simple tasks that we take for granted may seem insurmountable for people who have just arrived and have trauma and have experienced a change in their life circumstances. So there are many ways that people can help, whether you're in the diaspora or not, honestly.
I can take. Oh, sorry. I was going to say I can take the Somali version of that, which is that working closely with the Somali community in the diaspora in Minnesota. What I saw was that, and I don't know if you're tracking that, Somalia was just really, it was a failed state for like 30 years. And so really there, and it's not a fully incorporated country yet. Only a certain region has been incorporated in the last few years. And so there's been a lot of pulling of money by the Somali community, by the Somali diaspora to actually fund schools in Somalia. throughout those 30 years as an example of sort of the diaspora sort of financial support that they've been providing their own communities for just decades. And of course, in addition to that is a lobbying effort that's done in the United States to make sure that there is active support, but also attention on the issues. And I think that sort of the combination of that, in addition to then Somali diaspora actually coming into Somalia and helping to run the government, helping to run different community organizations, working closely with different donor and NGO organizations to really help be a part of that change. I think to me are the three sort of really brilliant ways in which the Somali community and the diaspora community really took charge of trying to help rebuild Somalia. And it's just, it's a beautiful, beautiful story. And then of course, on top of that, they have like, we have a Somali congressional representative now in Washington, DC as well, which is a huge success story for the Somali community. So I think for me, those are like the 3 or 4 possible ways in which the diaspora community can really seize and sort of take control of what's possible for a nation and a community.
Yeah, and kind of just adding to what we've been discussing, I think one of the aspects, at least in my personal experience, is really to try to educate individuals who don't have or can't even imagine the experiences that these individuals are going through, particularly looking at the issues at the US border with Mexico and all these individuals trying to seek asylum here. And I have Americans who are like, I can't believe they would send their kids without him. Like, I would never do that. I'm like, I don't think you understand how bad things are there. Ask yourself, like, how bad is it that these people are having to make that kind of decision? And humanizing these individuals and not thinking that, oh, they're just trying to seek some way to get better off and things like that. The choices they're making are not something that is taken lightly. And I think illuminating that among cultures, particularly the places that they're coming to, it gets into this idea of what Sarah was mentioning about lobbying and getting their voices heard from the people who actually make those big decisions. Because I think, unfortunately, we just don't have enough representation from those individuals to have their voices heard, their concerns heard, and things like that. And in my experience with having a lot of family in Cuba, and as you know, the relationships between the US and Cuba aren't exactly ideal, even having the ability to send back resources becomes quite problematic. And even though we want to help our family, we send it, it takes months to get mail, it takes months to get resources. Giving medication that they don't have takes a lot of issues. And so building a better network where for those individuals who do want to help. I think it's naive when people are like, well, they don't want, like, it's hard to get them help. I'm like, no, there's actually a lot of people who do want to help. It's just the means to do so is so hard and so difficult. It's not even worth going through those kind of legal ways to do it. There's illegal ways which we use to get money over there. But if there's a better network for those to assist, because there are a lot of people, and I think what Sarah mentioned about communities within those individuals who have become displaced, coming together and working together goes a long way. But the issue is getting them connected. And Minneapolis, they've done a really great job with the Somali group because they're really all came in a concentrated area and so forth. Trying to build those networks, particularly for individuals who've had those shared experiences, work together, because they alone also are the people who know what they want for their community and so forth to give back for them. And the other thing is that we building up, and I think the work that Alex is doing about building up the refugee stories and what they're going through is quite important, and particularly about those individuals who we consider successes. Even though I don't look at myself that way, and my parents and in my community, they look at me as a success. Oh, you're a professor, you got educated. And now I have a role to give back. And that does add pressure, that does add that I have to give back to the community. But it's not even having to do certain things, it's just the illusion that, look, they made it. That could be me, particularly for that next generation of those young kids who are coming over with their parents sacrificing everything for them. And I think Sarah was right, a lot of these individuals, particularly if they have children, it's their generation, their next thing. That's the hope of why they've made those tough decisions and so forth. And if those younger kids see someone who's done or had a similar experience and been successful in however they want to classify that, it's quite helpful as well, to give them hope and the initiative and the drive to seek out all opportunities for them to advance their standing in life and to assist all of those who are back home where the conflicts are being existed.
These are all really great examples about how the average citizen or person can contribute to post-conflict processes, even if they're far away from the actual place of conflict. And it talks a lot about, this issue of how do you assign responsibility for structural issues, something that individuals can't do on their own because it's not an individual issue, but it's most often the individuals that get blamed for how they respond to the aftermath of a conflict. Like, for instance, people still think that migration is the issue, not a response to an issue, So in sort of that vein, how do you assign, who is responsible for what at the post-conflict setting, especially when you're talking about how you differentiate between individual and collective responsibility?
I guess in thinking about where that responsibility is, I think regardless of who leads it, I think everyone feels like they have some shared responsibility, whether that's locally or even at its core nucleus of just their family. I think they have that experience or that kind of feel like they need to get back. But unfortunately, even if someone has the desire, they might not have the means to do so. And I think this is where getting their own input and their own collective decision-making from individuals of that group and selecting an individual or organization that kind of is the voice for them, who may have those resources and means, particularly with the lobbying and getting the adequate need that they want, and particularly what they want and not what we think they should have or what they need. It's kind of that approach and having that responsibility. And then at the end of the day, I think we assume that because of the conflict, they have no leadership or anything like that. There are local leaders, however, they might not have the power to do what is necessary to help their community, and really empowering them and giving them the resources to lead the community, who their own community have decided that may be the leaders of what they might want to pursue or need, would be quite helpful, because they've already self-selected that person is the person that they want to help them. The question is, can we empower that person to get to their goals of that community that they want to help?
Sarah or Alex, would you like to add anything?
I think Adrian sort of captured, I think, all the points that I think are relevant, in my opinion, on that question. I think that, at the end of the day, responsibility, I guess, to me, kind of means just accountability, and I don't know if there is probably a differentiation between individual accountability versus collective accountability. But at the end of the day, when you just see progress, that in itself is what actually kind of checks the box on a little bit of the responsibility and accountability, is that things are moving, things are happening, someone's doing something. And so yes, I think that it does, it's good to have individual accountability, just for, even for myself, right? It's good to have my individual accountability versus my family's sort of responsibility. But at the end of the day, if I see that collectively, my own family, we're moving forward together and there's progress together, I feel that that's what we should work towards, so that's the progress that you want to show to people, because that then hopefully creates a sort of forward momentum that continues to allow people to believe that, hey, you can trust in this process because it's working. It's working for us. Do you see that? Do you see that? Did you hear it? And I don't know if I don't know if you guys were, I think it's like one of Malcolm Gladwell's books when he talks about, actually it's word of mouth that has like the most success, in some of these like movie promotion materials. It's not necessarily advertisement. It's not actually all the money you put into it. It's actually how people feel and what they choose to share with their own community. And I think that's to me how an example of what we need to be working towards.
Yeah, I honestly, I think both Adrian and Sarah summarized it really well. I would just add, I think there's, in seeing that progress, I think there is kind of like a ripple effect that happens because you are seeing like success stories. And so you become more motivated to actually do something. And I think as global leaders and global citizens, I think we all owe the world a responsibility to do something. And it doesn't have to be something grandiose. I think it could just be something on a local level. And I would look into what's the skill set that you can offer in order to kind of maximize and match like the need with your own skill set, so that you aren't duplicating services, for example, because you do tend to see that in the nonprofit world. So I would look into like what are the actual local needs, and how is it that you can best serve those needs.
Yeah, Alex brings up a good point. The only thing I'll add is that I think the big issues, especially people who it's just awareness, and not meaning that like, oh, I know there's conflict over there, but how is that impacting them from an individual level in their day-to-day life? I think a lot of individuals who even may feel like they want to help, they're like, well, I have my own issues, I have my own problems, I don't have time and things like that. But recognizing and providing education, and particularly of little ways that they can help. It doesn't have to be sending $50 a month or anything like that. Volunteering once a week, once a month even, goes a long ways to the individuals that they're volunteering to help out in ways that they can't even imagine. And you can hear how much these people have this one impact, one experience really shape people's lives. And I think having individuals be aware of these conflicts and being aware that they don't have to, like I said, do something grandiose and create a new nonprofit or anything like that. But even little acts of kindness or things like that goes a long way to an individual's lives, and they can change that in a much more brighter hope for the future.
And that seems like a good positive note to wrap up our webinar. We are now opening the floor for questions from the audience. So feel free to submit it in the chat or even privately if you want to do it anonymously. And I shall relay it to our wonderful panelists. Just to start off this last 10-minute Q&A session, we do have one question. So this attendee would like to ask, in your experience, what does the overlap between humanitarian action, development, and peacekeeping look
I can take that one because I feel like I've seen a lot of that. It's a lot of competing priorities, is what it is. It is, if I can just paint the picture really, it's many countries and their own strategic objectives. It's a lot of people coming from some of those donor countries, like myself included, working for the United States government. It's a lot of different militaries that are involved and their security forces, right? It's a lot of private contractors also involved, and some would say maybe there are war profiteers as well. You have the NGOs, the humanitarians, and then of course you have the long-term development people with a completely different, set of own sort of people, personnel. And then you add all of that and you have a completely different priorities and objectives from every different angle, country, security, development. And what you see is a big soup with a lot of different characters and unclear sometimes what it's going to taste like at the end of the day. And you have a government really struggling to figure out what makes the most sense, right? Who do I listen to today? Do I listen to the general on the ground, or do I listen to the UN one day, or do I listen to the US ambassador versus the UK ambassador versus, the Russian ambassador, right? And so you have this huge contextual difficulty to manage, first of all, right? Just for the average person who's actually been working there, because as a person, I mean, that's the context, but for myself, just even working there, I need to understand all of that to actually then understand what actually does the community want? Do they understand all of these things that are happening around them? And how do I make sure that they get what they still need? that it actually makes sense within the context as well, right? Because they actually may be in the crux of all of that, right? They may be in the crux of the humanitarian and peacekeeping and all that stuff as well. And so it is a very difficult environment. That's why these mechanisms exist. Like what Alex said, the UN is there. They have their missions. You have the humanitarian principles for a reason. And then you have a government who really needs to kind of lead those discussions. And often I find that when they are not feel or seen as powerful enough, they're not really leading. And so then they pivot based on who they're listening to that day, that week, that month, that year. And I think that that's where some of the difficulties lie in terms of if long-term development priorities are, if the general is listening to someone who's focused more on the kinetic operations on the ground, long-term sort of development, not just aid, but just any development towards their long-term future is a difficult conversation when you're thinking about short-term objectives and goals that may be more related to humanitarian aid or military operations on the ground. And so then you already see the juxtaposition of that sort of difficulty and why certain countries can't really make decisions towards their future. And people often say, why can't they do that? Why is this country like this? And it's like, I'm sorry, have you heard of disasters kind of like coming your way, and have you been able to pay attention when there's a flood in front of you? And that's sort of the situation of a lot of these places. And I think that that's where as a humanitarian, as a diplomat, as a person that really when you understand the whole context, you have to be the right advisor that really objectively, without thinking about your own country sometimes, right? Your own objective sometimes you really have to put yourself outside of those shoes and say, what actually makes sense for this country? And try to work from that lens as much as possible. And instead of putting that hat on that you're actually paid to put that hat on sometimes, right? Like that Mercy Corps hat on one day, or the security force hat, or the US diplomat. It actually what's good for this country, because they're juggling with a lot and their priorities are shifting. And it's really difficult to manage all of this mumbo jumbo for this country, for these people. So how can we actually think about them and what makes sense for their own future?
Alex or Adrian, would you like to add anything, or shall I move on to the next question?
The only thing I'll add is I think Sarah illuminated the complexity of these issues a lot. And I think a naive thing that sometimes we go into these kind of things that we know what's best for them, when in fact we are assuming that we think that this is the ideal scenario that they would like, instead of really getting their input, their feedback, those things like that. And when people talk about, oh, that country, they're always, my wife is half Honduran, and Honduras has a lot of issues locally, internationally. But the issue is, even if they know what they want, how are they able to reach that if there are other individuals, countries, governments who have their own self-interest, who really sometimes even oppose what might be their ideal thing? And so going in with beyond your own self-interest, but understanding what is it that they need and what is their end goal. I agree with Sarah. I think a lot of times we go in, well, we're going to clean this up in 5 years, this will be that. I'm like, yeah, but we're talking about generations that you're affecting over time, and having long-term plans that everyone is in agreement for, or at least particularly the individuals who are going to be most affected by it, having their input and their say is vital.
We have one last question before we wrap up this webinar. And this question is about, how can we make sure that our actions post-conflict do not expand the nonprofit industrial complex or the military industrial complex? I can unpack that a little bit because I am familiar with the concept, unless anyone would like to take the lead on that. But I think this question seems to be asking, how do you sort of imagine a way out of this industrial complex that we're already in, once war strikes.
I don't want to monopolize, but I'm actually in business school. I just finished business school because of my many years in conflict locations. And I realized, there's not a lot of sustainability in some of the stuff that we're doing. And so one quick answer, because I don't want to monopolize, is that I do think that we don't think enough about sustainability in a lot of these conversations, and what does that actually mean. And of course, not every strategic objective requires sustainability in that conversation, but from what I've seen, I really feel like the missing component to a lot of these conflicts, and I think that people would disagree with me because they may think that there's a lot of war profiteers already, but I actually think it's the private sector. But the private sector thinking about sustainability of some of the sort of initiatives, and how do we, for instance, there's a lot of conversations around displacement, migration, and myself working on the Afghan resettlement, and I think about the UN sort of role and traditional role in this space, and I think, is this working? I don't know if this is working. There are 71 million refugees right now, and there's a 20-year backlog, and why are individuals living in camps for 20 years right now? Like, that doesn't have to happen. So when I think about sustainability, I am thinking about how can the private sector actually play a role in sort of creating efficiencies and these sort of public sort of in the public domain, so that we're disrupting what we thought was actually something that was working. But actually, let's actually figure out, can it actually work even better? And I think that's what I'm talking about in terms of private sector. It's not the big war defense contractors coming in to play a role. It's more like, how do we bring some of these new enterprises coming into the picture so that they can actually play a different sort of sustainable role, so that it's not relying on sort of the UNs, the USAIDs, the Mercy Corps to continue doing what they've been doing, which is great and it's needed. But what's another way that we can actually make this work a little bit better, hopefully? So that's something that I've been sort of thinking about.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sarah. I actually have an example to kind of illustrate what she's talking about. So there's this nonprofit organization, they're called Basmen Zetoune, and they work with Syrian refugee women in Shatila settlement in Lebanon. And they were initially an NGO, and they would train these women on different embroidery techniques. But most of the funding that they were receiving were from international donors or UN grants, and it wasn't sustainable, given that every few months you'd have to apply to a new grant, and there's instability. Are we going to keep the project? Are we not going to keep the project? And so they decided to do a feasibility analysis and see, can we turn this into a social enterprise, where they would be able to pay for the overhead costs by selling the products that they were producing. And they did, and that was a very much more efficient and more sustainable way of ensuring that this program was going to continue and remain alive. And it was a way of providing a source of income to these women, and they became empowered to become heads of their own households, providing a source of income for these women. And so kind of thinking along those lines, just thinking more about, how can we make this more about capacity building to empower someone to take on those roles versus just, donating and just throwing money at something as a band-aid that isn't, going to last that long.
Yeah, and kind of adding to what Alex said, I think it's a poignant point about this idea of empowerment and having the ability for individuals to run their own government, their own local regions, and so forth. Growing up, I would always ask my dad and my grandfather, both my grandfathers fought in the Cuban Revolution. And I was like, wait, why'd you go against Batista? And he's like, imagine being in a country where you couldn't own everything or couldn't go up because Americans owned the top. So you're literally in a region where you're trying to work, advance, knowing there's a ceiling because outside individuals with their own interests are capping how much the local individuals who want to empower themselves, empower the communities, are stopped because of those outside interests. And I think empowering those individuals at the individual level, but also the community, and having the feeling that they have a say and the ability to change their future within their own region or country. It's a quite uplifting thing, but when you feel like it's capped and ceiling, there's all these things that won't allow you to reach that. It really does sap your motivation and ability to advance not only yourself, but the people that you care about.
Alex, I just want you to know that I finished school for social entrepreneurship. So
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I'd love to actually hear more about both of your works because I also, Adrian, I'm also half Cuban. I haven't like mentioned that, but yeah, I would love to connect with you both further.
No, for sure. Same.
I love that we're all connected. And yeah, thank you so much everyone for attending this webinar. If anyone's interested in looking at resources for the last question, this reminds me of a concept I've been reading lately on non-reformist reform. And it talks exactly about how like the criteria that you can use as guidelines for when you want to do something that does not reinforce what the current system is already doing, if that makes sense. So the question that comes up is what we're doing now something we have to undo later? Sort of that kind of logical framework, I would say. Would recommend the book by Mariam Kaba, We Do This Till We Free Us. And this other writer, I believe her name is Harsha Walia. She's a activist from British Columbia, and she's written extensively as well about this. And I think her book was called Overgrowing Hegemony. So I'd recommend all of you to check it out if you have time. But yeah, that's it for today. Thank you all for attending, and thank you so much to all of the panelists for taking the time out of your day to speak with us and share insights and your knowledge. I hope this has been useful for everyone, and it'll be on our YouTube channel shortly for more people to view.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you. Bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.